Greetings, I am your instructor for today. I'm Michael Angelo Maglake, a registered psychometrician, and we will talk about Introduction to Cognitive Psychology. Before we dive into the topics of cognitive psychology, let us talk about the history of cognitive psychology. Plato and Aristotle were called rationalists because they emphasized the role of the mind in acquiring knowledge. Plato believed in nativism, that knowledge is inherited and is therefore natural or an innate component of the human mind. Aristotle, however, was called an empiricist since he focused on sensory information as the basis of knowledge, and he formulated his laws of association as follows. The law of similarity, which means recall of the similar objects. The law of contrast, the recall of things that are opposite. And the law of contiguity, recall of an activity which is frequently related with a previous one. There are also other scientists who had provided notions about cognitive process during the old times. René Descartes studied the relationship between the mind and the body. He believed that the mind could initiate behavior. John Locke believed that the infant's mind at birth is a tabula rasa or a blank slate. There is nothing in the mind that is not first in the senses except the mind itself, meaning it's blank, total blank or total emptiness or nothingness. Franz Joseph Gall examined the shape of the skull. He assumed that the faculties are located in specific parts of the brain, and his study is called phrenology. Charles Darwin introduced the theory of evolution. He perceived human being as a combination of biological heritage and human experience. There's also Hermann Ebbinghaus. He believed that learning and memory can be studied experimentally. Therefore, he introduced the famous nonsense material. Let's continue the history of cognitive psychology. Interest in learning and memory can be traced to the practice of Greek orators memorizing their materials on stage performances, stage speeches. They used mnemonic device, a technique used to remembering things, as it is derived from the Greek myth known as Mnemosyne, which means the goddess of memory. Later, a German physiologist and physicist, Gustav Theodor Fechner, believed and published the Element of Psychophysics in 1860. His experimental studies resulted in the establishment of the Weber-Fechner law, which states that the strength of the sensation perceived by an individual is proportional to the logarithm of stimulus used to elicit sensation. Thus, this inspired Hermann Ebbinghaus to conduct quantifiable analysis of mental processes of learning and memory. After more than a decade after Ebbinghaus' publication of Monograph on Memory, Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, a Russian physiologist, won the Nobel Prize for his studies on the physiology of digestion, where introduced the respondent of classical conditioning, in which we use it now, and in theories of personality we discuss classical conditioning. In 1900, in the United States, E.L. Thorndike of Columbia University became interested in the nature of the learning process. He used cats and chickens for his experiments and his studies. Thorndike's observation was described as trial and error and was accepted by many psychologists as a basic form of animal training. In 1930, Boris Skinner invented an apparatus known as Skinner's box. And this device contained a lever that operates to dispense pellets of food, the type of learning he discovered now as known as operant conditioning. Now let's talk about the nature of learning. One of the most common questions always your parents ask you while you were young or even now is, what did you learn in school today? Most of you commonly replies, I don't know and nothing. Does this indicate a general weakness in our educational system? Of course not. It just simply indicates that among other things, that much of learning takes place without our realizing that we're actually learning. Thus, one of the nature of learning is that life consists of continuous experiences. There are many activities that we recognize as learned skills like throwing a ball, playing the piano, and programming a computer. There are also other things that we do not think of as being learned, like how should we taste the difference or discriminate pizza from hamburgers, or the difference between the foods from Jollibee and McDonald's. However, these tastes are actually also learned. We learn it. Now, what do you think is learning? So what is learning actually? Learning is a process by which experience or practice results in a relatively permanent change of behavior. Learning means the gaining of knowledge or skill, the relatively permanent modification of response as a result of experience, which are useful in the attainment of the goals or ultimate needs of human beings. Essential aspects of this definition are noteworthy. First, the term learning does not apply to temporary changes in behavior, such as those coming from drugs, illness, or fatigue. Second, it does not refer to changes resulting from maturation or biological influences. Third is that learning can result from vicarious as well as from direct experiences. You can be affected by observing events and behavior in your environment as well as by participating in them, according to Bandura. Finally, changes produced by learning are not always positive in nature. People can acquire bad habits as well as good ones. It covers changes that are opposite of improvement. Permanent changes in behavior brought about by maturational influences or biological changes are not considered as learning. Now let's talk about the theory of learning. A source of information about learning is through theory. Briefly defined, a theory is a set of interrelated constructs, concepts, principles, and hypotheses, which attempt to explain, predict, or control a set of phenomenon. A theory of learning involves the efficient methods of explaining the nature of the learning process. It describes, explains, or predicts conditions under which learning does or does not occur. A theory of learning describes, explains, and controls the relationship between the teacher's behavior and the student's learning process. It explains how the teacher's behavior affects learning in the student. It considers the behavior of the teacher as the cause and the learning of the student as the effect. However, behavior of teachers is only one special category or environmental condition under which learning occurs. Learning can in fact occur even in the absence of a teacher. Learning should be facilitated and accelerated rather than hindering the behavior of the teacher. Learning also occurs because of rather than in spite of the teacher. Now let's talk about the essential aspects of the learning process according to Molly. First, there is motivation. An organism is constantly being bombarded by a lot of stimulus from the environment. One's response to any stimulus is directly proportional to the relative strength of one's motive. There's also the goal. It's a behavior. Being purposive, it has meaning. It is oriented towards a determined achievement. What determines whether or not a person will strive towards a goal is the perceived probability of success. Goal achievement does not always result from a reduction of tension, but from the strengthening of expectancy. There's also this readiness, depends on training, experience, and heredity. Actually, it is rated into different factors. It is rated from physiological factors, which is maturation of sense organs, the psychological factors from your motives, emotional factors, and self-concept. And also these experiential factors, which is your previously learned skills and concepts. Another essential aspect of learning is the obstacle. The presence of obstacles is an occasion for learning. New modes of adjustment. It is a hindrance or deterrence that challenges the learning. More challenge, more learning happens. And then there's also these responses. Responses are actions or behavioral tendencies according to one's interpretation of the situation. It may take the form of a direct attack or a form in a circumventing manner. What we call going around the bush. Going around the bush. Our next topic is about the learning curve. Well, we talk about learning, and of course, we need to know about the learning curve. Well, a learning curve is a graphic device showing the quality of a subject's performance after successive units of practice. In plotting or dotting, a learning curve, it is customary to show the units of practice as distance along the base of the graph, the baseline of the graph. The amount of performance done in a given unit, the x and y axis, is shown as a distance on the vertical axis. Either errors or correct responses may be plotted. When errors are used, the curve falls as learning proceeds. Curve falls as learning proceeds. When correct responses are plotted, the curve is a rising one. Learning curves display a variety of shapes. depending on the skill being learned and the particular type of performance measure being employed. In interpreting learning curves, it is very important to note which particular aspect of performance is being recorded. Generally, a person who is successfully acquiring a new habit is likely to have a curve of decreasing errors and the curve of increasing correct responses. If he or she is performing more and more poorly, the graph will show a curve of increasing energy cost and decreasing speed of responses. Any curve depicting learning will show chance fluctuations moving upward and downward in different parts of its course. In order to prevent these chance fluctuations from confusing the final result, it is common practice to combine the result of a large number of subjects, more fun, into one curve on the theory that they would not all be distracted at the same moment or all have the same difficulty with a particular item. A scientist who had contributed in the learning curve is W. L. Bryant. He discovered the learning curve while studying and mastering the telegraph code. He concluded that the typical characteristics of the learning curve are: learning has ups and downs, it is not always manifested by good performances, learning is faster during the first trials and slows down as the final trial is reached. And when plateau is reached, learning slows down, and at this point, rest, you need to take a rest because rest is vital to overcome fatigue and boredom. He also provided two types of learning curves: the positively accelerated, where performance increases with every trial, and the negatively accelerated learning curve, where performance slows down or decreases for every trial. Now, what do you think are the things that we learn? What do we learn? What are the things that we learn? First, there is the simple responses. This is the least complicated kind of learning. It is when an established bit of behavior occurs in the presence of a new stimulus. So, for an example, is an infant who is frightened by a loud noise and responds to furry animals in the same way, even if the loud noise and the furry animals are not associated with the child's experience. We also have these muscular habits. Well, over the years, we develop highly coordinated skills and sequences of behavior. When such learning involves mainly the use of muscles, it is called motor learning. It is possible to account learning for more complex motor habits in terms of the simple forms of conditioning, like running, standing, jumping, and etc. We also have these perceptual responses, symbolic interpretation that involves past experiences. Interpretation occurs in terms of what is already somehow stored in the brain. How do we perceive things and how do we respond from them? We also have the motives. Although there are motives that are inherent at birth, many of our motives are learned through the process of contending with the world in which we were born. Even the basic psychological drives are learned through experience, the time, place, and number in which such motives like hunger or thirst are appropriately and successfully expressed. We also have these attitudes. We learn attitudes. As we go through life, we learn to respond readily to selected aspects of the environment. And these responses are attitudes which are learned. We learn attitudes. We also learn emotional responses. We learn what to do with fear and what to love, who to love, when to love, where to love. We learn to fear high places or enclosed places. We learn to blush on certain situations when you see your crush or smile happily to our friends. There's also this problem solving. We learn how to solve problems as we grow up. We are perhaps the most impressive kind of learning human beings are capable of is learning to think and solve the puzzles the world presents, the puzzles of life. This kind of learning involves the complex application of old experiences to new and different situations. We can also learn language. We learn words and combination of words. We learn mathematical and other symbols. We learn to represent the world in terms of words and symbols. And we learn to describe the world to other organisms. Thus, after learning, we can also learn personality. If we view personality as the pattern characteristics of the whole adjusting organism, we have to grant that much of personality is learned. Although some characteristics of the total human system are based directly on heredity and reach their mature state through the process of maturation, most behavioral traits such as extroversion or sociability are largely a result of learning. And also, if you integrate all of these things that you learn, it can be a sense or a short description of your own personality. That wraps up our discussion about the lecture on Introduction to Cognitive Psychology. Thank you for watching. I am not requiring, but I hope you would subscribe for more lecture video presentations. Thank you and God bless everyone.